Your spiritual practice might be the thing preventing your awakening. Not because the practice is wrong, because you've become so skilled at the appearance of inner work that you've fooled even yourself. The seeking has become the hiding place. You've read the books and sat the retreats, done the practices. You can explain ego dissolution. You understand projection intellectually. You know the shadow exists and why integration matters. And that's precisely the problem. You still react to old wounds when you swore you'd processed them. You still catch yourself performing awakening rather than inhabiting it. You still feel the gap between what you know and what you've actually become. But here's what you haven't considered. That gap isn't a sign you need more practice. It's a sign that practice itself has become an avoidance. What's on the other side of closing that gap? You stop choosing partners based on wound matching and calling it a soul connection. You stop sabotaging opportunities the moment they become real. You stop performing emotions you think you should have instead of feeling what's actually present. But getting there requires walking through something first. This is the territory no one prepares you for. Not the initial awakening. Not the exciting phase where synchronicities pile up and everything becomes meaningful. This is what comes after. When the spiritual high fades and you're left with yourself. When the frameworks that once illuminated now feel like another layer of conceptual armor. When you realize that understanding shadow intellectually and integrating it are separated by a chasm most seekers never cross. You're not going backward. You're not losing your realization. You've arrived at the threshold where knowledge stops working and embodiment demands payment. And the currency is everything you've been unwilling to feel. Section 1. The exhaustion of seeking. There's a particular fatigue that sets in after years on the path. Not physical tiredness. Something deeper. A weariness that lives in the bones of your seeking itself. You've accumulated practices like others accumulate possessions. Morning meditation, breathwork, journaling, shadow prompts, somatic exercises, plant medicine, retreats, teachers, frameworks, more, each one promising the missing piece. Each one delivers insight without completion. You've had genuine openings, moments where the separate self dissolved and something vaster looked through your eyes, glimpses of what the texts describe. But the glimpses don't stay. The separate self reconstitutes. The old patterns resurface with embarrassing persistence, and slowly a suspicion begins to form. What if the problem isn't that you haven't found the right practice? What if the problem is that you've been using practice to avoid the one thing that would actually change you? Quick test. When you imagine stopping all spiritual practice for 1 month, no meditation, no journaling, no breathwork, no reading, what happens in your body? If you feel panic, relief can seem threatening. That's information. If you feel nothing, you might already be further along than you think. If you feel curious, you're ready for what comes next. The spiritual ego is subtle. It can co-opt anything. It can turn shadow work into identity. I'm the one who goes deep. It can make integration into performance. Watch me feel my feelings. It can transform awakening itself into another achievement to collect. Meanwhile, the actual shadow material sits untouched. Not because you're consciously avoiding it, but because you've gotten so good at looking like you're doing the work, you fooled yourself. The seeking itself has become the hiding place. What is the one thing that would actually change you? No more practice. Not a deeper understanding. Not another framework. Direct contact with what you've been practicing to avoid. The emotion you won't let yourself feel fully. The memory you won't revisit. The truth about yourself you won't acknowledge. That's the thing. And your entire spiritual life has been organized around not touching it. Pause. But you can't hide forever. The shadow knows where you live. And eventually, it stops waiting for permission. At some point, the shadow stops waiting for you to be ready. It doesn't care about your meditation schedule, your integration timeline, or whether you've built adequate support structures. It surfaces, maybe through the body, unexplained tension that won't release, chronic activation that no amount of regulation touches, physical symptoms that have no medical explanation but carry emotional weight you can feel through a relationship. The same pattern appears with different faces. The same wound is getting triggered by other people. The same dynamic is playing out despite your awareness of it. Maybe through dreams, figures appearing that disturb you, scenarios that feel more real than waking life, messages from the unconscious that your conscious mind can't quite decode but can't ignore either. Or maybe through a crisis, the relationship that finally breaks, the career that collapses, the identity structure can no longer hold. However it arrives, the shadow's emergence shares one quality: it cannot be spiritually bypassed. Pause, not in the obvious way. You already know better than to chase good vibes. You're sophisticated enough to recognize toxic positivity. But there are subtler forms of bypass, using non-dual awareness to transcend rather than include. This is all just experience arising, true. And also, you're using that truth to avoid feeling what actually hurts. Intellectualizing shadow content. Understanding why you have the wound without actually grieving what was lost. Mapping the pattern without letting it move through you. Premature forgiveness. Deciding you've released the anger before you've actually felt it. Spiritual concepts becoming shields against raw human emotion. The shadow sees through all of it. It knows the difference between genuine integration and sophisticated avoidance. Here's something you can use immediately. Next time a strong emotion surfaces and you reach for a practice to manage it, pause. Ask, am I using this practice to be with what I'm feeling or to not feel it? That single question changes everything. It's the difference between integration and sophisticated suppression. You'll know by your resistance to asking it. The shadow contains everything you pushed away to survive. And here's what makes this hard. Those survival strategies worked. The suppression kept you functional. The avoidance kept you moving. You're not weak for having developed them. You're adaptive. But adaptation that saves you at 10 suffocates you at 40. What protected you then imprisons you now. The shadow is every version of you that learned to disappear. It doesn't rise to destroy you. It rises to be reunited with you. That's why awakening feels like falling apart, because the identity you built on suppression begins to crack. You cry for no reason. You feel empty and full at the same time. You question everything. You feel like you're losing your mind, when in truth you're losing your illusions. You're not collapsing, you're confronting. And confrontation is sacred. And it will keep surfacing until you meet it on its terms, not yours. Shadow work that actually transforms requires more than journaling prompts. Not because journaling is useless, but the shadow doesn't live in the cognitive realm where journaling operates. It lives in the body, in the unconscious, in the spaces between your thoughts. Reaching it requires practices that bypass the mind's defenses. Jung's primary method. Not visualization, not guided meditation. Direct dialogue with autonomous figures in the psyche. You sit in stillness and invite what wants to come. A figure appears, not one you construct, but one that emerges. You engage it. Ask questions. Let it respond. The responses will surprise you because they're not coming from your conscious mind. This practice is not comfortable. The figures that appear often represent exactly what you've rejected. They may be angry. They may be wounded. They may embody qualities you find repulsive. That's the point. The discomfort is the compass. What you resist encountering is precisely what needs integration. Everything that triggers a disproportionate reaction in you points to shadow material. Not mild irritation, disproportionate response. The anger that floods you when someone displays a quality you claim not to have. The contempt you feel toward people who embody what you've rejected in yourself. The practice. When a strong reaction arises toward another person, pause. Ask not what's wrong with them, but what in me does this person represent that I've disowned? This is harder than it sounds. The ego will insist the reaction is justified. The other person really is that way. Maybe they are. And also, if you didn't have that quality in your shadow, you wouldn't react with such charge. The projection is yours regardless of the other person's behavior. 2 practices so far. Each one targets different shadow access points. Active imagination works through image and dialogue. Projection tracking works through relationship and reaction. Notice which one created more resistance in you as I described it. That resistance is information. 2 more approaches. Shadow lives in the nervous system as much as the psyche. When emotional material surfaces, attention goes to the body rather than the story. Where does this live physically? What's the texture, temperature, movement quality? Stay with the sensation without narrative. Let it express without needing to understand it first. Sound, movement, breath, whatever the body wants to do that doesn't harm. The mind wants to make meaning. Shadow work often requires letting the body complete its process before meaning arrives. You are not singular. Multiple aspects exist within the psyche, each with its own logic, its own needs, its own protective strategy. The part that shuts down in conflict. The part that performs competence. The part that rages when boundaries get crossed. The part that seeks approval compulsively. These aren't problems to fix. They're adaptive strategies that developed for good reason. Shadow work means meeting each part with curiosity rather than judgment and understanding what it protects. Negotiating new arrangements. This is not the same as integrating your darkness. It's more nuanced. It's learning your internal landscape well enough to navigate it consciously, instead of being hijacked by whatever part gets triggered. A warning here. These practices open material that may exceed your capacity to process on your own. There's a difference between productive shadow engagement and re-traumatization. Signs you're exceeding your window of tolerance. Persistent dissociation. Flooding that isn't regulated. Loss of function in daily life. Suicidal ideation. Psychotic features. These are signals to slow down, not push through. Shadow work requires a strong enough container to hold what emerges. If the container isn't there, building it comes first. Sometimes that means working with a skilled therapist. Sometimes it means stabilizing life circumstances before diving deeper. Sometimes it means developing more regulatory capacity before opening more material. There's no valor in forcing shadow integration faster than your system can handle. The shadow has waited this long. It can wait until you're actually ready. The shadow isn't trying to overwhelm you. It's showing you where you lost yourself. And it shows you exactly how to come home. That's the promise. And it's real. But there's a danger in this process that I need to name, because the very practices that can liberate you can also become your next prison. Here's where many seekers get trapped. They discover shadow work and make it their identity. The perpetual processor. The one who's always working on themselves. The seeker who's replaced spiritual bypassing with psychological bypassing, now using trauma as the excuser rather than transcendence. Integration is not permanent excavation. It's not living in your wounds. It's not making darkness your home. It's not identifying with your shadow any more than you identified with your light. True integration has a particular quality. The material is acknowledged, felt, allowed, and then it becomes compost. It transforms into something that feeds rather than depletes. Pause. You know integration has occurred when the trigger loses its charge. Not through suppression or transcendence. The charge genuinely dissipates. You encounter what used to devastate you and feel nothing. Not numbness. Completion. The wound has closed. Not scarred over. Actually healed. The first time this happens, you won't believe it. You'll wait for the reaction to come. It won't. You can hold opposites without collapsing into either. The anger and the understanding. The grief and the gratitude. The human limitation and the vast awareness. Both present simultaneously without one cancelling the other. Your compassion deepens through specificity, not abstract loving kindness. You understand others because you've met the same qualities in yourself, the ones you used to judge. The energy you spent managing the shadow frees up. You didn't realize how much life force was bound in suppression until integration releases it. Suddenly, there's more of you available. You stop performing integration and simply are integrated. There's nothing to prove, nothing to demonstrate. The wholeness is quiet. This is different from the light and shadow merge language that gets thrown around. More precisely, what was split becomes available. The power you projected onto others gets reclaimed. The qualities you rejected become options you can choose consciously. The emotions you feared become information you can interpret. You're not transcending your humanity. You're inhabiting it fully for perhaps the first time. And from that fullness, something genuine begins to emerge. Not the awakening you imagined. Not the spiritual identity you constructed. Something more alive and less defined. Not because you avoided the dark, but because you walked straight through it. Pause. So what does that actually look like? Not in theory, in lived experience. When the integration settles into your nervous system and starts expressing through your choices, your relationships, your work, what changes? When shadow integration moves from concept to embodiment, life reorganizes. Not through manifestation magic, not because the universe rewards your inner work, but because you stop unconsciously creating from unexamined patterns. You stop choosing partners based on trauma bonding and calling it spiritual connection. You recognize the difference between genuine resonance and wound recognition. You stop abandoning yourself to keep the peace. That part of you that would rather lose yourself than lose the relationship. It's not running things anymore. You can stand firm and stay close simultaneously. You stop projecting your shadow onto your partner. When they trigger you, you own your material rather than making them responsible for your reaction. This changes everything. Intimacy deepens because you're no longer hiding half of yourself. You can be witnessed in your entirety because you've witnessed yourself first. Self-sabotage patterns become visible enough to interrupt. You see the moment you're about to undermine yourself and can choose differently. You stop shrinking to manage other people's comfort. The power you reclaimed from shadow work wants expression. You let it move through your work. Imposter syndrome loosens its grip. Not because you've convinced yourself you're worthy, but because you've stopped identifying with the part that insists you're not. You create from authentic impulse rather than wound-driven compensation. The difference is felt in what you produce and how it lands. Emotional regulation becomes genuine rather than performed. You're not suppressing or transcending. You're actually metabolizing what moves through you. The gap between stimulus and response widens. Space exists where reactivity used to be. From that space, choice becomes possible. You trust yourself differently. Not arrogant certainty. Quiet confidence that you can meet whatever arises internally. You've proven to yourself that you can handle your own depth. States still fluctuate. Integration doesn't mean permanent equanimity, but the fluctuations occur within a larger stability that doesn't break. This is what the spiritual path actually offers when shadow gets included. Not escape from the human condition. Full participation in it with awareness. Not transcendence of difficulty. Capacity to meet difficulty without fragmenting. Not perpetual peace. Aliveness that includes the full spectrum. Take a breath. Notice what's present in you right now. What this has stirred. What wants attention. That, whatever you're feeling, is more important than anything else I'm about to say. But let me say it anyway. You've been on this path long enough to know what's being asked. Meet what you've been avoiding. Not someday. Now. The shadow you've been circling isn't going to become less daunting. At some point, you step into the dark, not because you feel prepared, but because you're tired of the half-life you've been living. The discomfort is the threshold itself. What you feel when you consider really meeting your shadow, that resistance, that contraction, that subtle turning away, that's precisely the edge where your growth lives. And here's what no one tells you. The shadow wants integration as much as you do. It's not your enemy. It's the exiled part of yourself waiting for you to turn toward it finally. When you do, something alchemical occurs. Not immediately, not without pain, but genuinely. The light you've been seeking, it was never outside you. It was bound in the very darkness you've been avoiding. Go get it. Your shadow has been patient. It's waited years, decades, lifetimes even. It can wait a little longer. But can you?